Well, hey again, folks. This is exciting. We reached episode 4, which is the last in the digestive series. And in this one, we'll go into a fair amount of detail. We'll look at hormones of the digestive system. For example, gastrin, which is a hormone that makes you feel full once you've eaten. We'll look at enzymes and how those enzymes in the stomach, in particular, really ramp up, and how in the small intestine the job gets finished. We'll look at an enzyme list and see that there's a lot going on in there. This trip wouldn't be complete without a trip around the liver, and we have to look at the liver as a very important filter organ. So you're going to get some detail on the liver you haven't seen before. Finally, that takes us into sort of a quick overview of nutrition. I don't want to spend a lot of time there, but what I do want to go into are some of the nutritional disorders, things like scurvy, things that you might have heard of before. Okay, let's take a little trip over here, and what we'll look at is we'll look at what happens when protein in particular is digested by the stomach. All right. So in your stomach, you actually have some cells in the lining here, and they're called chief cells. Now I'm just going to pause that for one quick second. Now these chief cells, also known as peptic cells, they begin producing an enzyme once they're exposed to protein. And protein has to be broken down. It's pretty tough. Remember that protein has an amino group and basically like a hydrocarbon tail. So it's protein itself can be a source of sugar in our bodies, but it takes a long time to convert. If you've ever eaten steak and eggs for breakfast, or something really high in protein, fish, etc., it takes a very long time for that to be processed through the body, and it's a very slow burning fuel. Now, this protein digestion process happening in the stomach it's happening in an environment that's very suitable for this enzyme. Now, this enzyme is known when it begins as pepsinogen. It's activated by hydrochloric acid, sort of cleaved, just chopped up a bit into its more active form, and it starts to work over protein right away. Now, remember that protein will also need to be broke down into its polypeptides, dipeptides, and then into individual amino acids. That takes quite a bit of work. It's sort of like unknitting a sweater. So it's going to take the action of the stomach, hydrochloric acid, and then it's going to take action by the small intestine to finish the job. So this is pepsinogen before it's activated. It's activated by hydrochloric acid, and once pepsinogen is activated, it's a bit of a cascade reaction, and more of the inactive form becomes pepsin. And that's the go-to enzyme that will chop up your protein into what you see here. Each of these little balls in this chain here, those are amino acids, and what we're looking at are peptides. Now I'm going to go back to this one here. Stomach acid secretion, there's more to it than you thought. So I wanted to show you this. Okay. Here we go. Now, when we look at the cells of the stomach, what I had just shown you previously were the peptide producing cells known as the chief cells. Now there's a little bit more. There's some other cells in here as well. We'll take a boo at. And it's interesting how a whole variety of cells are required to sort of create a cascade effect and get everything working. So the parietal cells right here, these are the hydrochloric acid makers. Now you're looking at that saying, okay, hydrochloric acid, right, you told me about that. Hydrochloric acid is what turns on pepsinogen and activates it into that protein buzzsaw that we call the pepsin enzyme. Right, but we've got to go back a little bit more here. We've got to look, how did the cell, in particular, the parietal cell, what stimulated it to release hydrochloric acid in the first place? Well, the ECL, and that's just the short name for it, adjacent cell, actually turns on the parietal cell. The parietal cell, that big pink one, that's the hydrochloric acid producer. So we're going to look at this. It's kind of neat. So what happens is Let's move that up a little bit here. When we look at food entering the stomach, gastrin is a hormone. Now, this hormone, right, is the one that can make you feel full, but this G cell, now that's short for the hormone gastrin, the G cell, you notice that's really close to your bloodstream. These are just blood vessels in your stomach lining. And it will send the hormone gastrin. And if you watch, the presence of food in your stomach stretches the lining of the stomach, okay? It's sort of a pH and a little bit of a stretch reception thing. The G cell, sort of like, this is like pushing dominoes. The first domino that gets pushed over is the G cell. And the G cell produces gastrin, which is a hormone that'll make us feel full, but it also gets digestion going. And that makes sense because once our stomach begins to fill, well, maybe the G cell is important, right? It's pushing the whole assembly along. Now, the ECL cell, all it really does is stimulate using histamines, its neighbor, the parietal cell. So it takes the G cell to poke on the ECL cell, and now the parietal cell produces hydrochloric acid like crazy into basically into the intracellular space, and this will go up and be released into your stomach. And that hydrochloric acid, as we saw in this example, just do a quick replay on this here. It's the hydrochloric acid which is coming up here. There we go. Parietal cell produces the hydrochloric acid, which gets our pepsin enzyme rolling. So there we go. Pretty cool. And then we can digest protein really efficiently. So it's a little bit much to take in, but if, for example, when you're making notes in class, you just make a note that a G cell stimulates the ECL with gastrin, and the ECL cell produces a histamine that turns on the parietal cell, which produces hydrochloric acid, which then activates the pepsinogen to pepsin. And I know it's a lot, right? But we're analog systems. This is how our body works. Okay, so a little bit of note material here. This is where I need to jump out for just 1 second and turn on AirPlay because I have some notes that I do want to go over with you, and a diagram or two. Okay, so there we go. So when we look at, minimize that, the digestive organs, principally we'll start looking at the stomach, in this case just for protein digestion. Remember, carbohydrate digestion begins in the mouth. But protein digestion, well, that gets going in the stomach. So now we've looked at the important role of gastrin, right, with the G cells, and how we have to break down this really tough protein. Here's a neat, really nifty diagram, and I'll just do a little zoom here. By zooming in, you get a chance to take a look at these, basically what are called gastric glands. And glands are things that produce secretions, they produce hormones, they produce enzymes. One in particular is kind of important. You'll notice these ones right here. As we kind of go down into the gland, you'll see the mucus cell in this location. Let's change that color up. There we go. There's your mucus gland right there. And I referred to the stomach as protecting itself. So it produces sort of a slime that protects your protein-based stomach. Remember, stomach is an organ. It's made out of protein. So you need to coat it in mucus to protect it from itself. If you don't do that, you can get stomach ulcers or little burn spots, which in autopsies, it's pretty easy to identify someone that's had ulcers because you can see these red little burn marks on the surface of the stomach. Okay. The chief cells right here, also known as the peptic cells, these it might be a little subtle, but the chief cells are these, majority of them here, they are these orange cells that you see stacking up here. And those chief cells are the producers of pepsin. Well, let's be formal. Pepsinogen, where the parietal cells are the producers of hydrochloric acid. Now, your parietal cells are the yellow ones there. So it's quite a process, isn't it? Just to digest all this protein. Now, over here, there's a nice little, there we go, nice little overview of the process where you can see the chief cell producing its enzyme. That's pepsinogen there. That's the inactive form. But it takes the parietal cell and its hydrochloric acid right here to activate the enzyme to get us to pepsin right there. So there's quite a bit going on here. And if you zoom out and take a look, you can see how the stomach is lined with many of these glands. And the gastric gland includes the mucus producing cells, the chief or peptic cells, right, making pepsinogen, and the parietal cells making hydrochloric acid. And when the food comes down, that gastric juice is a combination of hormones. We have some gastrin being released in our bloodstream. We've got some hydrochloric acid. We've got pepsinogen being activated to pepsin. It's basically a hot enzymatic acidic mess. Okay. We've looked at the digestive organs here in summary. I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail. It's really important to understand that when this sort of hot acid mess comes out of our stomach into the small intestine, that it needs to be neutralized, which is a major role of the pancreas. And we also have the gallbladder emulsifying fat. And there's a whole pathway that I talked about in a previous lecture about how fat itself needs to be digested. But there's some really important things we have to focus in on here. We've seen that the small intestine has sort of a brush border, really high surface area, and each of these little sort of shag carpet fibers are actually these little things we call villi, and that's where the absorption occurs. This is where your circulatory system and your lymphatic system get so close that through the process of diffusion, passive, which is a passive process. Even with osmosis, we can absorb water. Some water can be absorbed through here. And there can be also some active pumping. So we're looking at active transport. Now, when we look at that brush border, right, along the surface there, there's a little bit more even going on. So just a couple of quick facts, but we're going to focus in on those that brush border and some of the enzymes that are produced there, because there's more to the story. So the small intestine isn't so small, not in length, 23 feet long, upwards of 23 feet. The duodenum is just the really short first region, 8 to 10 inches. The jejunum, where a lot of absorption goes on, and the ileum, really that makes up 20 of the potential 23 feet. So you can see that it's just all about absorption. And if you think back to the earthworm, when we dissected that in grade 11, the intestine was super long, and I said, well, think about it. This earthworm is just consuming what it finds in the dirt, and it's just passing it down its intestine, trying to get whatever nutrition it can get out of it. So, but in humans, you'll see that we have a much more complicated digestive system, right? We've got little tracts of the small intestine that do specific things. People seem to forget that the duodenum is a digestive region. They think it all happens in the stomach, but that's not so. Now, duodenal hormones are kind of important. We had talked about CCK, cholecystokinin, and that was really important for telling the gallbladder to contract and send down bile. It also told the pancreas to send down Pancreatic juices, which contain a whole variety of things, including amylase, lipase, and remember anything that ends in ASE is an enzyme, right? Good little trick. But it's not always so. For example, because another thing that will come down from the pancreas is trypsin, which is a protein digesting enzyme. But it's not called tryptase, it's called trypsin. Deceptive, isn't it? In point one there, they talk about secretin, which is another duodenal hormone. And think of it, there's more than one hormone acting here to stimulate the pancreas and liver to produce their secretions. Remember that the liver sort of needs a nudge to fill up the gallbladder with bile too. Okay. Now, when we look at these hormones, and I'll put the hormone list up in a minute, before trypsin becomes active, it's trypsinogen. Okay, so that's your protein digesting one there. And it's not enough just to break down your proteins into polypeptides. Now you're going to need peptidases, things that can break down polypeptides into dipeptides and so forth. So there's a few more enzymes. For example, this one becomes carboxypeptidase. Pro is just a word that means before there was. So in that case, that's the inactive version. And if you see ogen on the end, that's kind of like pro, indicating that it's an inactive form. So we've got chymotrypsin here, which helps to break down peptides even further. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to my browser because I have to turn off AirPlay for a moment. Give that a little rest. We had a list here. There it is, of all of the enzymes that are present, really, well, not all of them, but a good majority of them in the digestive system, from salivary amylase to pepsin, produced by the chief cells of the stomach, and in the pancreas, amylase, trypsin, chymotrypsin, carboxypeptidases. You can see there's a very large variety of enzymes. We saw the lipase, but there's even more. Nucleases. You have to think that if you consume something, and if you're consuming really any material, anything's made up of cells, you're consuming ribonucleic acids and deoxyribonucleic acids. So we have an enzyme to break those down called nucleases. Think about it. It's sort of like a factory. We'll take apart any structure into its smaller components. So these are called nucleases because they break down nucleotides. Not bad. When we get into the brush border of the small intestine, it produces a whole host of enzymes. We've got dextrinase, which will break down branched sugars into glucose. Maltase, it's an easy one to remember. Breaking down maltose. Sucrase breaks down sucrose into its glucose fructose components. Remember, sucrose is a disaccharide. A glugalac makes a lac, right? I taught that back in the first part of the course in biochemistry. So we have lactase. That's an enzyme that not all of us produce. And it goes on and on. One that's I think is kind of interesting. A lot of people don't realize that once you break down nucleic acids and you've got nucleotides, you can take the nucleotides further and rip apart the nucleotide into its sugar, into its phosphate, and into the bases, the A's and the G's and the C's and the T's that we talked about. So those are called nucleosidases that literally rip apart a nucleotide. Lots of them, an impressive array. So this list I have on the course site. You'll want to take a look at it because, well, it's biology and there's always more to know. So we'll just get back to the show here. There we go. And I'll just minimize that. Okay. Now, as far as the enzymes go, we've pretty well covered a whole host of them. Now, the accessory organs, one in particular that's not getting enough face time here is the liver. Now, if you notice, you take a look at the liver here, and I'm just going to draw something over top. When you look at these blood vessels in this region, okay, they're doing a whole bunch of absorbing. Now, you have to absorb all the goodness from the gut, but you don't dare take it and put it into systemic circulation without filtering. Think about it this way. What if you ate something that was toxic or bad for you? You ate a mushroom, right? Mycotoxins are some of the most toxic things in the world. If you want to preserve your homeostasis, here's an idea. Maybe you had better take a trip to the liver for a little detox. Okay, because everything needs to more or less be checked out. And with the liver, one of its many roles is to use what's called the hepatic portal vein right here. Okay, so it's a portal over to the liver, the hepatic system, and filter whatever might be present. Just a second here. Sorry that I have to alternate, but I've got a really good animation to show you how the liver works in this regard. Let's go here. This is what I wanted. Okay. So when you look at the hepatic portal vein leading up to the liver, this is basically the filtered blood leading away. So your mesenteric, this is all called your mesentery, and it leads to that is where the absorption goes on. And you can see that it appears blue because the digestive system has used up a lot of the available oxygen, and this blood needs a little recharge from the respiratory system. Nonetheless, as you go up the mesenteric artery until you join the hepatic portal system, or hepatic portal vein, this is full of probably the most nutrition in the body because you've just taken all the goodness from your digestive system. Now here you go. So the hepatic portal veins, we're looking at a cross section of the liver, and they're going to lead up here, and the liver is very high in endoplasmic reticulum, and what it does is it can filter toxins. Now the liver cells right here, they'll absorb the excess glycogen and things like that. This is where your liver becomes a repository for, essentially for starch. But once the filtration by the liver cells is done, we just bring the blood into these sinuses. The liver cells adjacent do their job, act as filters, and once they've absorbed necessary glycogen and detox things, you're going to see that the final filtrate is going to end up more or less here in what's called the central vein, and these pool and lead away from the liver into the hepatic veins. So now it's okay to take the blood and send it into the inferior vena cava. And the inferior vena cava goes up to the heart, and of course we're looking at sending the blood to the lungs for a recharge, but there's a tremendous amount of nutrition right now in the blood that's flowing out, and it's filtered. So I know that your kidneys are a filter organ, but your liver is an incredible filter organ that can't be really understated for what it does. So I'll have all these animations on the website. They're just absolutely fabulous, and they help to tell a story so well. Neat to see the actual function of the liver. True story. Okay. And we're back. So here's a quick rundown of the liver functions. Your liver, in addition to filtering your blood, produces urea. So that's a waste product from the blood, sort of a nitrogenous waste product. It also recycles your sort of old red blood cells. And the byproduct of that is called bilirubin, and that ends up in bile. If there's a problem with your liver, you can get too much bilirubin and bile in the blood, and you'll sort of get this yellowy jaundiced appearance we'll look at a little bit later. Your liver is just such a huge storehouse. And I like this arrow because it really shows what's going on. Sometimes our liver, under the influence of the hormone insulin, absorbs too much sugar from our blood. So after lunch, sometimes you'll feel that logy, super tired feeling because too much of the sugar that's in your blood has been absorbed and sort of put away for a rainy day as glycogen. That can happen. But insulin does its job. There's many hormones that can release sugar from your liver and from your muscles. But insulin's kind of like the big daddy. It's the one hormone that really puts glucose into storage, which is why problems with diabetes are so prevalent because we just have one storage hormone known as insulin. Detoxing drugs and alcohol. Well, drugs, alcohol trip through the liver, but you don't want to stress the liver too much, or you can get liver disorders, which we'll look at in a bit. Emulsification of fat in the duodenum. We've already looked sort of at the production of bile and how it's stored in the gallbladder. And we have a good little animation there of how what they'll do if they have to remove your gallbladder, a cholecystectomy. But your liver makes blood proteins. It produces albumin, which helps to sort of regulate your fluid levels in your body. So it's pretty darn important. It's doing so much. The sixth point is a big one. You're probably looking at it wondering, what the heck? Your liver produces about 70% of your cholesterol. And if we have cholesterol problems, if you've got if your cholesterol levels are too high, one of the things your doctor can put you on is called a statin, Crestor or Lipitor, and trying to basically block the production of sort of the bad cholesterol in the liver. It's those two drugs prevent an enzyme from producing some of this excess cholesterol. The end product is it brings your numbers down. Okay, little point about protein. Remember that it is a hydrocarbon source. So back to my steak and eggs conversation. If you chop up protein, if you deaminate and remove the amino group, you have a hydrocarbon chain. But that takes quite a bit of action by enzymes. Steak and eggs pretty well last all day. Bile, the fat emulsifier. The reason it appears kind of a yellowy green is the bilirubin, which is when you break down hemoglobin, an iron-based structure, you'll get this byproduct called bilirubin, and our bodies is kind of interesting. They're using bile has a little bit of that in it to help emulsify fats. And remember that that's going to be eliminated from the body in the feces. So we should look at what happens really when you get a little bit of bile being absorbed into the bloodstream. This happens in neonates or newborns, and this can also happen in people where they have problems with the liver, cases of hepatitis, things like that. And if you get a little bit of bile in the blood, there's an overproduction or there's an imbalance in the production of bile, too much bilirubin, for example, you can get a bit of it in the blood and it will stain the sclera. It's temporary, but right here, what you're seeing, right? There's a lot of blood vessels in the eyes, so you're seeing some of the bile end up there. So eyes can appear yellow. See if I can turn on my pen again. Ha, wake up, pen. There we go. You can also get the appearance in the skin there. And what's the good news is until some babies' livers get sort of working it up to speed, your baby might be born a little bit jaundiced, but a little bit of ultraviolet light breaks down bilirubin so that basically it's like a little low-level suntan for your child, and that yellow color will go away. So it's something good to know because it can really cause a lot of anxiety in new parents. Other liver disorders, you know about hepatitis, but there's actually two forms. There's Hep A, which is you get through infected water, and due to infected water, you can get infected shellfish. You get the idea. Salads, things like that, that have been treated with water that could be contaminated. Hep B, a little bit more serious, right? Because you've come into contact with contaminated blood products. And also Hep C, that's another one that's of major concern, right? And hepatitis, not really a lot. There's not really a lot of cures for hepatitis. But here's the thing: there is a vaccine. So you want to get vaccinated, especially if you're going to travel to regions where hepatitis has been a known concern, right? Get yourself vaccinated. And since hepatitis is a blood disorder, never ever share dirty needles. That's the quickest way to transmit bloodborne diseases such as HIV and hepatitis. Not good. So, breaks down the function of the liver, not good. And you'll see that jaundice can often be a result. Cirrhosis of the liver, that's with excessive consumption of alcohol. Alcohol is, as our bodies break down even our lactic acid, think of alcohol as being even worse than lactic acid. It's a metabolic product, and it's a strong base. It has to be eliminated from the body, so the endoplasmic reticulum of the liver goes to deal with it. So here you go, healthy liver on the left, right? And you can see what's happened to this liver. You can see the damage over time. You see the bubbly appearance because the liver is trying to detoxify so much ethanol. The cells, think of the cells as being stretched and literally ballooning because their endoplasmic reticulum is doing so much work, and it changes the appearance of the liver. So the digestive enzymes, quick overview, right? Digestion begins in the mouth, and starch, when we start to break that down with amylase, a lot of people think, oh, that's it, starch all the way to sugar. No, I mean, if you're going to break down starch, you're going to break it into smaller subunits. So, for example, maltose, right, which is a glucose dimer. Okay, so what's next? We've got these hydrolytic enzymes. And remember, go back and watch the enzyme chapter again, and remember that it's the introduction of water, hydrolysis, that is used to break apart the bonds between our nutrients. So we call them hydrolytic enzymes for a reason. In the stomach, kind of recap this quite a bit, but when it comes to pepsin, right, we're not all the way down to amino acids. So you go from proteins, it's a hydrolytic process. Proteins, the enzyme pepsin is going to break it down into longer chains, which are our peptides. So we're getting there. Oops. Haha. Bang. I see one little error on this slide that I can't let go, and it's right down here. This little devil right here should say lipids. I really have to find a stylus that works better. It's driving me crazy. There we go. Now I'm happy. So, sort of an overview. We've already seen starch and protein being broken down. Lipids, this is the emulsifier here, right? Bile salts from the liver, courtesy of the gallbladder. And then if we have some lipase, we can break ourselves down to our glycerol and 3 fatty acid particles. Again, that goes back to our biochemistry unit, which is why we do it first, so that you're more aware of this. These are the subunits. True story. Bam. The small intestinal hormones we had looked at. If you've got peptides, then, let's see if we can switch this color. Try a new color here. There we go. All right. The stylus is misbehaving, but that's okay. Peptides, if we use peptidases, really, we're going from the branched amino acids just down to the amino acids. Bring in more specific enzymes like maltase, and you can break apart maltose into glucose. So here you go. And our bodies want to break things down into the individual sort of Lego pieces so that we can reassemble them as we see fit. Okay, now here it is. I still remember when I was about your age studying for the provincial exam, Biology 12, and I looked at this table and said, you must be kidding. Actually, you know most of this already. This is a table you have to commit to memory. It's par for the course, okay? So do yourself a favor and just write test on this, okay? Because it always will be testable. Each of the columns talks about the specific nutrient they're going to digest, okay? Each of the rows talks about the enzyme in a specific place in the digestive system. So I won't spend a huge amount of time going over this table, but what I will tell you is you need to know this table. From the nucleases that break down nucleotides to the nucleosidases that literally break down DNA into the phosphate, ribose sugar, or deoxyribose sugar, and the base, whether that's the A, G, C, or T. See how they're apart there? That's what the nucleosidase does. As you look at the proteins, kind of from top to bottom, starting with the large nutrient, the proteins, pepsin starts to break it down, and then other enzymes now come in and they start to break down the polypeptides into smaller peptides, right? Trypsin, chymotrypsin. Remember, trypsin specifically, that's coming down from, well, chymotrypsin, those are coming down from your pancreas, right? So they're going to work over that protein that's already been worked over. And then your small intestine is going to produce some more things, right, that you see here, to break down the peptides into even smaller subunits. So you can see that it's a reduction as we go down the table. So in the name of time and sanity, know the table. Bam, moving on. You might have heard of the essential amino acids. There are 20. Now, depending on your genes, for example, my dog, who's sleeping over there on the bed and being a good little girl, she can make a lot more amino acids than I can. In fact, there's 9 that I can't make at all. Now, the whole point is that there's 20 amino acids that we require, 9 that are essential. So when it comes to getting your amino acids, remember that your DNA needs amino acids to make everything in your body, right? So as far as complete proteins go, and it's just factual, folks, they're all in meat. So fish and chicken and, lamb and all sorts of things. If you decide that you're not going to consume meat, that's fine. That's a choice. You have to get your 20 amino acids. But you can't just, for example, just consume soy. I mean, it doesn't have all the amino acids. But if you are smart and you play the combination game, take beans, put them with rice, you'll have all the amino acids that you need. So yes, veganism totally completely works. And big shout out for veganism, tremendous amounts of dietary fiber that it's worked quite well for Bill Clinton. He had suffered from a lot of problems with sort of plugged cardiovascular blood vessels, cardiovascular disease, and has converted pretty well to veganism and has done a great job of cleaning up his health that way. So at this part of the lecture, this is where I just talk a little bit about nutrition. When it comes to your consumption of protein, males need a little bit more. We have a little bit more muscle mass on average. It's a testosterone thing, but you don't need to eat like a giant steak. You don't need you think about, you could eat literally a 1 pound steak, and that's like 500. Let's put it this way: 1 pound is it's 2.2. Let's just write that out. There's 2.2 pounds per 1 kilo. So when you consume, let's say you consume a steak that is basically a pound, that's half a kilo, that's 500 grams. Well, that's like 10 times as much protein as a 140-pound male would require. Now, now that's on average. If let's say you're bodybuilding or you're doing really intense physical activity and you need to rebuild your tissues, well, you might need a lot more. I remember taking protein powder when we were working out and doing the Schwarzenegger thing back in the day. But you can get a lot of protein from your diet, quite a bit. This is an outdated pyramid, but what it shows really, all it's really about, and you've seen this in planning class probably, is you want to consume a lot of the things that are at the base, the fruits and the vegetables and the whole grains, not the processed stuff, right? The processed stuff has to be fortified for what is missing, for goodness sake. As you move up the pyramid, you need less of things. So when you get to the top, take a look at the fats and the oils and the sugars, basically a trip to the donut shop. Okay, of course you consume it sparingly because that stuff has some of the most caloric material in it. Sugar itself is very refined, goes straight basically into the bloodstream. It's very high in calories. When you look at fat, it's 9 calories a gram. So it's all about balance. I always listen to Dr. Art Hister on Global in the morning, and he talks about balance, right? Eat a balanced diet. Enough said. I put this slide on because there's been different diet fads. I remember in the 70s, sugar was the enemy, and that kind of proceeded into the 80s. And then in the 90s, fat was a total enemy because somebody noticed fat was 9 calories a gram. And if you take that out of your diet, wow, you'll lose a lot of weight. But that's not always so smart because our hormones are largely fat based. We need them. If you cut fat from your diet entirely, it's a very unhealthy thing to do, and it's definitely not a balanced approach. Not good. Now, some people will cut fat in the name of, they'll look at the food pyramid and say, oh, it's so caloric. But you shouldn't consume a lot of fat, right? It's not like you're drinking bottles of Mazola or something. Obesity is a result of it. Basically, your caloric intake doesn't meet your caloric expenditure. So, you're not moving around enough and you're taking in too many calories. Obesity can cause a lot of pressure on things, so we get high blood pressure. It's not good because we can get things like diabetes, cardiovascular disease. If you're too heavy, you can have a greater instance of sleep apnea, which is where you're not breathing through the night. Gout, which is uric acid crystals forming in your bloodstream around your joints, so it hurts when you walk because you've got this very painful material forming on your joints. So getting obesity down is extremely important. It's the number one thing you can do to improve your health, but not, you shouldn't obsess over. So really what works, look, here's a simple rule. It took a long time to put that weight on. It'll take a long time to take it off. So if little things put it on, do little things to take it off. Take the stairs, get your metabolic engine revving, right? You don't have to run, you don't have to sprint, you don't have to do 5Ks or Ironman or Iron Women events. Just increase your metabolic output. And there's got all these little fitness devices now you can attach to yourself, and you sort of challenge yourself to do a little more each day. Get out there with your pet, a little less screen time. It's kind of ironic since I'm recording this using screen time. But reduce your body fat and try to get about half an hour a day, right? Of course, you could get a lot more time in, right? If you really love exercise, more or less, yes, go out and do it. But listen to your body. Listen to the little aches and pains try to tell you something. Ligaments, tendons, back pain. Over-exercising is as bad as under-exercising, right? And plus, if you injure yourself, you're not going to be able to exercise. So listen to your body. It's telling you things. Get your rest. If you're going to reduce really body mass, if you could just nibble away at your calories, on average, let's say teenagers, early 20-year-olds, if you're looking at about a 3,500 calories per, really 3,500 calories per day, if you could take that down just by a smidge, let's say you decrease 500 calories as shown here in bullet point 1, that's 3,500 calories per week. And 3,500 calories, that comes up on about a pound of fat. So you could start to take it down slowly. And it's better because your body itself In maintaining its equilibrium, your body doesn't like big changes and will fight back against large scale change. It's a homeostasis thing. It's better to just sort of slowly deceive the body back down to a lower body weight than it is to crash weight gain. Crash weight gain, never a good idea. Little shout out here about some of the problems we can also have in our bodies. A lot of African Americans, and by a lot I mean 75%, don't have the enzyme to digest the sugar that's in milk. That's lactose. So products have been produced like lactate that you see here, and lactate itself helps people to digest lactose down into its glucose and galactose subunits, right? If you don't do this, I have a friend who's very lactose intolerant, and if they consume, ice cream or anything, what'll happen is the sugar will ferment in the gut, and that leads to the cramping and the diarrhea, and it's just not a good thing, right? So you can take little enzymatic helpers, right, like lactate, or be smart and just avoid milk, right? There are alternatives, almond milk, etc. Okay. Now, as far as vitamin deficiencies go, I said this was going to be kind of the last thing. You might have heard about this one if in your historical studies, social studies, and whatnot. You would have heard about the explorers getting stuck over the winter. I believe Anticosti Island was one example that comes to mind, where they ran out of their supply of fruits and vegetables, and what happened is they don't get enough vitamin C. And without vitamin C, you have a problem in the proper production of your connective tissue. And this can lead to all sorts of problems. Your teeth will get wiggly, they'll fall out. It's very, very bad. We need vitamin C to produce proper connective tissue. So, yeah, not good. If you're consuming a lot of really processed grains, what you find is you're not going to get a lot of your B vitamins in proper supply. Niacin, which is B3, if you don't get that, you can get what's called pellagra, which is skin disease, and you see an unfortunate instance of it here, right? So what do you have to consume to get a lot of these vitamins? Well, this is where your broccoli comes in. Broccoli. You can look at your meat products, turkey, fish, tuna. Obviously, those are really good sources of niacin. But really, fresh fruits and vegetables and fresh fish, fresh meat that's, well, of course, cooked, but not really processed stuff. Because a lot of this stuff is water soluble, these B vitamins, and you can lose them in the processing. So, not good. There's also vitamin D deficiency, which is called rickets. Now, it's not, vitamin D has a lot to do with calcium and phosphorus absorption. So, in the case of rickets, what will happen, and I'll just move to the next slide for 1 second, I'll come back. You get malformation in the construction of the bones. So, this could be a big problem, obviously, in third world countries, but it can happen here too. And if vitamin D is deficient, you'll find that there's a problem in calcium uptake, phosphorus, and you get these misshapen limbs, right? And that's lifetime. That's tough to get over. But preventable. Vitamin D is very high in things like milk. You'll find it in vitamin D very high in a lot of fat-based things. Milk, cheese. If you get that, you're good. Vitamin A, also another important one. If you don't get enough vitamin A, you'll find that you'll have a difficulty at night. If you're driving, really seeing in depth. It's like your rods, which are one of the light detection cells in your retina. They're just not functioning at peak efficiency, so you can get night blindness, which is obviously quite concerning. I have family members that talk about this. Not a vitamin A deficiency, but night blindness. It's pretty tough. My dad defers to my mom and just says, "You drive," because I have a hard time seeing the turnoffs, and never good when you're driving and traveling. Vitamin K is an interesting one. Vitamin K is largely produced in our large intestine, sort of in conjunction with E. coli, the bacteria there. So if you take too many antibiotics, for example, you can have a problem with vitamin K. And if you have a deficiency there, vitamin K is really important for platelets, and the whole blood clotting thing. So, yeah, you don't want to go there. Here's a B6 deficiency, and pyridoxine, believe is what vitamin B6 is called formally. And you'll get the oily scalp. It's a problem with energy production, so you become kind of weak, irritable, and you'll get that chiliosis, which is that scarring you're seeing on the edge of the mouth there, right? So again, this can happen with a lot of overprocessed grains, a lot of that white flour. You really want to eat more of the vegetables and the grains in their sort of their initial state, right? Because it's a B vitamin and it can be lost in the processing. And I guess last but not least, we'll poke a little fun at sodium here. Okay, I always look at high school students and say, "Holy, you guys are chiposauruses." The amount of salt in a bag of chips will take you right into this 400 to 3,300 milligrams per day. Not a small bag, mind you, but over time, right? Our bodies crave salt. We need it for our muscles. We need it for our nerves don't function properly without it. But if you flood your cardiovascular system with salt, water will follow. And the problem that you get is you get greater fluid volume in your blood vessels, and that pushes on the blood vessels and raises your blood pressure, which is what BP is all about down here. Okay? So your blood pressure will increase if your salt intake is much too high, right? And this is really just an osmosis thing. Water follows salt. And you think about it in your major blood vessels, maybe you're not so worried, right? Pressure on those. But what about when you get to the little fine blood vessels, like the capillaries in your brain, right? Capillaries in the back of your eye, right? You would never hold your breath while lifting weights. That creates pressure, and you can get burst capillaries in your eye, for example. I did that as a kid. But if you're going to increase the pressure, well, you can also do that by over consuming salt. So you don't want to do that either, right? You don't want heart attacks, strokes, anything like that. So keep your sodium under control. That's not to say cut out sodium entirely. Just you don't really have to add it actively, right? When you have corn, you don't have to have, I watch my dad consume corn, and sometimes I laugh and say, "Geez, Dad, would you like a little? Would you like a little, corn with your salt?" And it's just in his generation, it was butter and salt, and they just loved it, right? And they weren't as aware of these sort of intake requirements and concerns. But that's what happens. And with time and a little education, right? We've definitely reduced that salt intake, and that's good.